Now let's have a look at Test 3, 2010 for the DIPAC students. Now this one here has some similarities to the CTA question. Obviously in going and having a look at the scenario first, and let's have a quick look at it together. First thing we notice when you look at this scenario here is creditors recon, point 1. So for the DIPAC students last year, they were also given a creditors recon. We can probably anticipate that the required is likely to be very similar. Now this is a very good opportunity for you, CTAs or DIPACs, having just done the CTA 2010 question, to go and seriously see whether you can nail this creditors recon question. We've worked through it together. You've got an idea as to how to tackle that kind of question. I really want to strongly recommend that you attempt this question, even if it's just the creditors recon part, under test conditions, full-time allocations, and see if you can get 100% for that question. You really should be able to. There's nothing fundamentally different to what we've spoken about with the CTA question. Below that, there's then reference to provisions. Now here we've got something a little bit different to the CTA guys. We've now got an account balance there, provision for damages, 80,000 Rand. And there's some information about that. We read it through, and we see it's about defective rugby balls. The court, it's gone to court. The court has found the company guilty, and basically now we're just waiting for settlement to go and pay the customer. Over the page, the only audit procedure that they've performed on that damages provision is they've obtained a management representation letter. Okay, so that's the scenario. Creditors recon, provision for damages. Obviously, we're expecting our required to be along those kinds of lines. So let's have a look at the required just to confirm whether that's what we thought. We've got 4 requireds here. Typically, from a DIPAC perspective, this is representative. It tends to be broken down into smaller chunks. Although, again, the biggest chunk there is a 20 marker, which is the one on the creditors recon procedures. But other than that, question A is a couple of questions around the audit of the opening balances. You are told that this is the first time you're doing the audit. B, discuss the criteria that you would have used to select these creditors to test. The clerk that's done the work here has gone and used certain criteria to go and select creditors, and you're needing to comment on those criteria, those selection processes that the trainee accountant has followed, before then going and indicating what it is that you would have done in terms of identifying creditors to test. Part 3 of the required was this creditors recon. That's the one I'm going to encourage you to do. And then part D was to do with the provision for damages. From an accounting perspective, is it appropriate that they're recording it? And then from a management representation letter perspective, is it okay to just get a management representation letter about this? And then lastly, what additional procedures, additional to the management representation letter, would you need to perform on this provision for damages? Okay, so in terms of the preparation, before we look at the solution, my suggestion here is that you take A, B, and D and do those as very brief high-level summaries. So if you got this as a question, how would you tackle that question? What would you do? What ideas would you put down? What structure would you create in your answer? When it comes to part C, describe the audit procedures that you should perform on the creditors recon. That's the one that I really would recommend you try under test conditions. When you then look at this solution, it's a really good opportunity to see. That's 20 out of the 40 marks. If you can nail that question, then the pressure's off. The other ones are then less important. Okay, so give it a go. High-level summaries for A, B, and D, and attempt question C under test conditions. When you're done, obviously come back, hit play again, and we'll work through the solution and have a look at how you should have tackled those questions. Okay, let's now have a look through as to how you should have approached the question. If we switch to the mind map, the 4 parts to the required, if we just start off with an understanding of the required again, A, B, C, D. Part A, a very straightforward question, probably not something to expect at a CTA level, and probably in hindsight with DIPACs being pitched upper level this year, perhaps not to be expected at DIPAC level either. In respect of the opening balances, describe the auditor's objectives in this regard. So what are the auditor's objectives when it comes to auditing the opening balances? And list the procedures that you must perform in respect of these opening balances. Now, this is where you are very grateful that you can take this big green book into the exams with you, because to answer that and score 6 out of 6 is the easiest thing in the world. There is an open book reference for that, ISA 510. It's one of the ones we spoke about, one of the ones that you would have flagged. And you'll find literally, I mean, you don't write it word for word, but you literally could. In paragraph 3, it states there are 2 audit objectives in terms of the audit of opening balances. And it states in paragraphs 5, 6, and 7 what audit procedures you should perform on these opening balances. So that's no application practically to the scenario here. It's literally just taking the information out of the open book and dumping 6 marks down onto your page. If you don't get those 6 marks, then I do worry. You should get those 6 marks quite easily. Okay, so question A, not very challenging. Let's have a look at B. That is a little bit more challenging. If we break this required down here, for 7 marks, we need to discuss. So positives, negatives, looking at it from both perspectives, looking at the bigger picture. The criteria that must be used for the selection of creditors for audit purposes. So how do you go and choose creditors to now go along and test? Also, indicate if you agree with the trainee accountant. Now, in terms of agreeing with the trainee accountant, we need to be quite clear as to defining what it is that the trainee accountant has done, so we can then make a decision as to whether we agree or not. Motivate in detail. Motivate both whether you agree with the trainee or not and the criteria that you would use to select creditors. So let's have a look at that one. The first part of this is whether you agree with the trainee or not, and the second part, what criteria would you consider for selection. In terms of agreement with the trainee, what is it that the trainee has done? There's a reference in the scenario there to the trainee only including those creditors with high values. So we need to decide whether we agree or disagree with this. In my opinion, I would disagree with that. We obviously then need to go along and motivate in detail. So why would I disagree with that? Well, essentially, there's 2 arguments against what they've done. Creditors as a liability, credit balance. Our primary concern in terms of the assertions with creditors is going to be, from an understatement perspective, completeness. If you go and include creditors that have high RAND values, those are the ones that probably carry the least risk in terms of leaving out creditors, of missing transactions. So in terms of going and deciding, the argument, small value creditors are probably potentially more at risk than high value ones. And if you're going to select anything specifically, maybe you should be focusing on the small value creditors, not the high value ones. Also, they've gone and selected these creditors with high values from the creditors list. Now, the danger with doing that, if you're concerned with understatement of creditors, with missing creditors, is if the creditor hasn't been recorded at all, it won't be on the year-end creditors list. So for you to go and select from the year-end list, you will not ever pick up a creditor that's not on there. So generally, your selection process when you're going to go and choose creditors should be from off the current year list. You should be selecting from the prior year list of creditors. You should be selecting from your knowledge of the company's business, where you know which suppliers they deal with. Select those. Are they on the list? Maybe discussions with the buyers. Who have you bought from during the year? Have you bought from anyone new during the year? If so, who are they? Are they on the list? Okay, so that's the first problem, is their direction of testing seems to have been wrong. They're focusing on high value overstatement concerns, whereas they should be focusing on the opposite concern, the understatement concern, the low value concern. The other problem I have with the way they've gone and selected those high value creditors is they've gone and chosen only certain creditors. And they've specifically gone and included only creditors that have got high values. This is quite a big population of creditors. In the scenario there, I think they talk about there being 236 creditors or something along those lines. Yeah, 236 suppliers. They have now gone and chosen the big ones out of the 236 suppliers. You might get decent coverage, perhaps, in terms of the RAND value that you're testing. But the problem with going and selecting specific items only is that the remaining creditors you basically can't conclude on. You haven't performed any tests on them. So a better way of doing this would have been to have gone and essentially done sampling. So you might be going and identifying certain creditors that you are concerned about and pulling those out as individually significant items and selecting and testing those. But then for the remaining population, you need to get evidence about it. It's very likely to be material, given the high RAND values that we're dealing with here. So you should then be going to go and select a representative sample of the remaining creditors and go and perform tests on that sample to allow you to then conclude on the whole population. All right, so the two concerns, overstatement and only selecting individual items, not selecting from a sample base. The second part of this question asked us to go along and consider and discuss criteria for selection. So it's kind of an independent part of the required to whether you agree with the trainee or not. You could almost go along and ignore what the trainee has done. The question here is saying, if you had to go along and select creditors, how would you choose specific creditors to go along and test? Bearing in mind that we're wanting to pull out potential problem ones and then probably do a sample into the remaining portion of the population. So these are some of the kind of considerations that you would take into account. The bottom line is if you're going to be selecting individual ones, you want to select ones that contain a higher risk of misstatement. And in this case, with creditors, liabilities, understatement, a higher risk of understatement. International suppliers probably need to form part of that. They're generally, the transactions there are more complex. You've got foreign currency issues. There are often delays in delivery of stuff, perhaps delays in the transfer of documentation or the availability of documentation. So they do generally carry a higher risk, that there may be elements left out of them, incomplete. And maybe a consideration here would be to go and stratify the population. So you would separate your population into international suppliers, local suppliers. The international suppliers you would then test separately, reach your conclusions about them. And then the local suppliers, you would then go and choose specific items out of that and sample the rest. Potential indicators of problems could be long outstanding suppliers. The danger here is, why have they not been settled? Is there a dispute? Is there something that we're waiting for? Potential disputes, potential problems with some of the assertions. If a supplier is sitting there with a debit balance, potential overpayments, potential non-invoicing from the supplier side, that would be flagged as a risk of a higher risk of misstatement, so we should be choosing and testing it. Suppliers that have dropped considerably in relation to the prior year gives an indication, particularly if we expect them to be at higher levels, why are they at such low levels? Could there be missing transactions in them? And then suppliers that we were dealing with last year that have not been on the current year list. Those also carry risk in the sense that we are still dealing with them, but they've not created them at all this year. They've not raised the liability at all. Okay, so those are some criteria that you could consider for selection. The solution has a couple of others as well that you could think about.